The other day I was talking to my father, who's an expert in medicine. It just so happens because he has a degree in medicine, but it turned out he actually knows quite a bit about nutrition, which is nice because my mother is obsessed with cooking. So combine the two, and you have an ultra traditional household that creates basically stuffing your children who live in that household with an ultra mega amount of food that is mainly nutritionally well balanced, but most importantly, it is such high quantity that the children will have to learn nutrition themselves because if they don't, the sheer amount of food that they ingest and consume will become their end. Now, that's literally what happened to me as the third child when I received so much food in my mother's apartment where I was living, because in this economy where I live, which happens to be one of the two most corrupt countries in the EU, if you do not have a house, you are a nobody, according to a Central European author who is a woman in a local magazine made for women, which I read a few years ago, which had been written maybe a decade ago, which had been found in my grandmother's house by my mother, who rescued those magazines. Anyway, so basically, when I came back from my mother's apartment, I realized I came back because of the food exposure. Like, I couldn't literally go back there every day and just eat everything all the time that my mother was cooking, because first of all, I was losing more and more trust in my mom for doing that, because it built resentment in me, because it felt like my mother had no boundaries, first of all. And as they say, having no boundaries creates resentment in your children, and being too strict creates rebellion. So while my father had always been mainly very strict as a Christian parent who had actually read the Old Testament, my mother was a quote unquote unconscious Catholic all her life. She would cook every day, and then many times she would just transport that food to wherever her kids were, except my brother would always just move around the globe so fast she could never really reach her these days. So he was the exception, but me and my sister would always just be, kind of addicted to this cycle of, being my mommy's girl. And honestly, I realize it's not my fault, because as I would, work on and off, having actual jobs, and basically ruining my eyesight almost by chatting with my exes and, kind of trying to build online businesses alone in this economy, I realized I need physical space. Like, I need a place either on my name or a place where I could just wind down and not be bothered about exposure of flattery, or even in the form of food exposure. But the upside of this whole abundance slash individualism exposure is that, again, my father is really educated, my mother is really educated, so sometimes they give a lot of good information. And I was having a conversation with my father how at one point I remember I have had all types of eating disorders. And, I'm not particularly secretive about my past, because I believe that once you have healed from something, once you have accepted and integrated something, you really can work with that as like part of yourself without being embarrassed about it, because then other people may learn from it. And since you're the only one who, can handle that with expertise and experience, other people can also learn from it. But beware, because sometimes social pendulums do not support your uniqueness or your personal experience. I would only suggest putting that on the front page or on display if you really feel like it could make a good point in the conversation. So I brought up my eating disorder situation. I literally said, like, I had all types of eating disorders, including binge eating, bulimia, and anorexia nervosa. And the reason for that is because when someone is in a situation like that, they do not realize what mentality put them in that situation. So, for example, with anorexia, people see themselves much larger than they actually are when they look in the mirror or when they look at themselves. And it wasn't until I got into an actual hormonal change in my body that I realized my perception of myself had literally been so delusional that I could not believe how much my viewing my own body changed afterwards, even though my body weight literally didn't change at all, or my body composition barely changed at all, let alone my bone density and things like that. So it's like, it really is up to perception. And when you're really so spiritually or emotionally or financially unstable or insecure, it really is up to your self-esteem and your self-certainty, how much you put up the white flag as a means to kind of signal to people, I have a problem, you do need to cause more problems here. And often abusive environments tend to support that kind of quote unquote self-sabotage relationship with yourself, because they will not not drag you down once you're confident, once you look like you have high self-esteem, because they also suffer from low self-esteem themselves. And people create more of what they are and who they are. So it's just natural in a way for people to make people be more on their level, no matter which level they are on. But often when the majority of any collective of people are on a lower level, it's just the norm that people who are above that level become the exception and they become ostracized. And in order to save energy, the ostracized ones lower their standards, not even to heal, just to not feel like they constantly want to break out of their shell with no success. And instead, they choose to comply and adapt. And as such, they will not inspire any more people or people anymore or any longer to grow, but they will no longer be the odd one out. So that's what happens to people who are naturally healthy, who literally have been born with a body that you not obviously choose to be born with, but who literally want to get more out of life, if you know what I mean, because they do not fit into their current environment, or because their current environment is normalized to be sick and lonely or something like that. So when I would eat so much food, it would usually be because I would kind of, as an animal myself, because I am a mammal, like I am a human being, I would eat so as to escape immediately after, because it's a flight or fight reaction for someone to like all of a sudden be extremely hungry after an abusive episode, for example, and then flee. But since I could never really flee because the economy wouldn't support that whatsoever. Like, I literally never even knew I had an option until I realized the world was much bigger than my country. I would just eat and eat and not stop until I was almost sick. And the opposite is almost like again, due to low self-esteem, but it's not healthy either. So, you know, the 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 answer is not self-development in that, you get all your needs met yourself. Like, you literally, as a human being, we're not built to do that. Like, we are not the species to succeed alone. Like, that's not we are, and that's the problem. Because when you live in an economy, for example, that does not support um, succeeding with others, because your environment just somehow doesn't inspire you or doesn't motivate you enough, or even inhibits your progress in a way, then you will end up alone. You will end up feeling lonely. But individualism makes it seem like that's almost normal, and it makes it seem like the economy is structured so that that's possible. But there are economies in the world where that is literally not possible, where you literally still have to depend on community and family and things like that. But then again, mental health comes in the picture, because mental health is one of those things that not the entire world has adopted yet. So, for example, Romania has no mental institution there, which implies that families are still the main, smallest unit that people have to depend on to survive. And just one country to the west, which I am from, we do have mental institute here, and that is a major, drawback in a way, because that confuses family structure in and of itself. Because, for example, you can call the police on another family member, and then they immediately take you to the hospital, and then immediately they hospitalize you, not because of your physical situation, but because you're quote unquote, for example, schizophrenia, which they never diagnosed you with, but they put on the papers so that they could even, take you to the hospital. So you're there for basically no logical reason, except your family member got upset with you, and that kind of breaks the family structure in and of itself. And you all of a sudden stop relying on the one unit of society that your life depended on. Now, obviously, you can like get stronger in a way, but I do believe that such experience do not make you stronger. They make you weaker, even though they force you to grow a hard shell around you, for the very reason that a system is only so strong as its weakest part. And a family is not weak. A family is very strong as a unit in society. Like, it's very, anti-red pill when I say this, but it's true that belonging to a group of people tends to make you stronger, even if that unit in and of itself may not be the strongest community that you've ever seen, for example, because a human being was meant to survive in groups and in groups of people, the same way that a deer was meant to survive among deers, right? And you take that away from a person, even then, they put you elsewhere where only there are people, except you get to belong to those people temporarily the same way. So it's like you can take yourself out of those, toxic environments and things like that, but the places you'll end up in will be either as toxic as the ones that you've been in, or they will be better, um or they will be worse. But if they are better, that's only because they're very conscious. And that's the thing I'm trying to say, is that mental health care literally makes no sense unless we make it so conscious that people there go there for reasons as logical and as reasonable as people belong to the nuclear family in any country. Because in Romania there is no mental health care, and people survive, people get by, people are well, people are good, and they're not complaining because there's no mental health care. Like, people literally have one of two choices: they either leave the country or they stay in the country. But in places where mental health care complicates the picture, it's like the people who stay are also in a more complicated situation, and they have one of two options: either they accept the whole map of social rules that come with a society integrating mental health care, and thereby they accept the idea of their family member possibly being received by hospitals all of a sudden due to quote unquote psychological reasons, or they do not accept it. But then again, what can they do except leave the country? So it's like, I do not believe that every country should have this as like their last resort, especially if it's a weak economy. And I think it's like a very dichotomy. It's much like a dichotomy when you take a weak economy and you put mental health care in there. Like, it's very not like pro individual, so the other day I remember I also talked to my father about this energy saving mode that many people get into after they are exposed to the uncertainty about and around nuclear family, which countries that do not have mental health care are exposed to in Europe in 2026. And it's really mind-blowing how people can shift after, like, they literally put their lives at stake for the purpose of belonging outside of their nuclear family, in hopes that they actually can manage. Because, like, obviously many people, knowing that they have an option, they will make an effort. Like, they will try to at least survive where they are. But had they not had an option, their approach to nuclear family would possibly be completely different. Like, people are in Romania still, in my opinion, where daughters and sons are kind of more traditional, or just less rebellious, because even parents are like less preoccupied with their parents getting to hospitals and things like that. So it's like, um once a cherry is sick, it makes all cherries touching it look sick as well. And that's the same way it works with people. When you have one sick family member, it makes everyone else around them sick. But knowing that someone has an option to leave, they might choose to leave. But if mental health care complicates the situation by kind of giving the appearance of comfort, or kind of giving the appearance of the option to leave, which is not really a viable option in the long run, because it only kind of perpetuates the problem, which I may talk about later. you know, because mental health care seems to kind of suppress grief instead of work through it with the individual, especially the psychiatric unit, as I noticed, that in the long run makes matters worse in the nuclear family for sure. So, that seems to give an illusion of comfort, but despite temporary relief, it makes matter worse in the long run. That's one. And I also had been talking to my father with regards, like, I touched the topic of nutrition because, um, you know, communities and families always would gather around food and communal meals, and eating has always been deemed a very important activity in any social group, and it still is a matter today, and especially in traditional families, women are kind of still in the kitchen, both figuratively and literally, and they find their creativity there. They are good at expressing themselves there, even sometimes at the expense of burning the whole kitchen. But apart from that, you know, many parents limit themselves to physical means of providing to their children, and emotionally they deprive them of themselves. And the same way, they may go out and cheat on their husbands or wives, or they may leave the family or abandon the family without even talking about it or treating it as taboo later in the family. And that puts another level of pressure and burden on the family, because cheating and generally sexual sin is the greatest sin. And that is because when you attach yourself to someone else on a soul level, that creates an attachment that will be, part of you for the rest of your life, because it is a physical means of unifying yourself with another creation of God, who also has the body of God or Christ or source, and that is literally hurting yourself through God and also hurting someone else directly. So when you even treat that as a taboo topic, even after you have dealt with such a situation, people inevitably will find out, and when they do, and when they feel the amplitude and the weight of the situation, and you still do not talk about that as the perpetrator, that in and of itself will make you look worse than you have ever looked. Because, like, you cannot hide sin. You cannot hide anything in this world. And obviously, the greater your sin, or the more impact your sin potentially has, the more it will affect you. So, one reason I do favor traditional households is because, again, rules are kind of defined. They kind of tend to follow a specific path that is specifically designed for either gender, and so they are secured, they are safe, and they support and complement each other. But on the other hand, when there is a nail in the coffin, so to speak, some duties or some behaviors, when they are left unconscious or treated in an unconscious way, or suppressed still, they do not complement each other anymore, and that causes so much trouble in the following generations. And so that is one reason why traditional households also need other households and other couples' help and other communities and just community in general to implement themselves into and to integrate into, because they themselves may not be enough to understand themselves alone. Like they need a separate opinion, especially if there are multiple people involved who have no choice but to be unconscious, like children who do not have fully developed brains, who do not have the means of being an adult, like a functioning adult, making their own money, moving and essentially having rights. But I also talked to my father about how food used to be so scarce that when, prehistoric times, people would run around for food. Inevitably, their bodies would pick, or they would switch to a mode that enabled them to think more clearly, see more sharply, and just have their senses more highly alert and attuned to their environment. And in today's world, this is not a problem any more than food abundance and in general information overload is and are, because when you have such high amounts of food, right, that you can hardly stop eating and be noticed for it, you will also create excess potential, like in your body, in your system, and then you will want to stop both eating and thinking so much. And when you do not have the choice to kind of create your own environment in such abundance, or your own safe haven, or your own safe space, regardless of whether you have a family or not, or a community, that kind of puts fuel on the fire of digestion, specifically sticking with this subject. And, you literally have the option of adapt or leave. And that is when true change happens. It is when you realize potential or you abandon it forever. It is not when you do not even realize you have an option to change, but when you ultimately decide to leave a situation or stay in it, that you either stay the same or change for the better. And sometimes that comes with a change of environment, a change of scenery. But assuming you do not do that for any reason, for example, for socioeconomic reasons, you basically limit yourself. And the reason I want to talk about that separately is because I truly believe that religion is often looked at as like this inhibiting factor that limits individuals' growth because of the quote unquote social quota or the social pressure induced by values of the group. But honestly, that looks like a cult to me, and I do not believe religion is a cult. And often I believe nuclear family can be more of a cult than community or a religion. And that is because nuclear family, the more unconscious it is, it can literally be a cult, no matter how small. But religion, on the other hand, carries such classic values that, when treated consciously, no matter how, accumulated or how dense they are, or how dense it is in values, no matter how confusing it can seem due to negativity in it, it may still be a better outlet for new members, or new consumers, or people interested in it, to like feel at home with, because it is not so focused on individualism, it is not so focused on modern self-development, it is not so focused on neoliberalism, it is not so focused on politics, it is not even so detached. It is a collection of all human values kind of mastered. And I believe any community functions best when they carry a lot of those values on a conscious, day-to-day, curated level. Like, every day they consciously live those values, instead of saying or keeping up appearances that they do. But in a world we live, which emphasizes individualism so much, it's really hard to maintain those values, no matter which community a person belongs to, because even staying in a community takes a commitment unlike ever before, in my opinion. And so it is really the realization of how important we are to each other and how irreplaceable we are to each other, because of family structure and because of the importance of the family unit to begin with, that will maintain any human community or communion. Because unless we realize that we'll literally create a world where everyone is irreplaceable, and that's not the truth. Because, for example, I remember when I was growing up, my mother would angrily say, choose a different mother then. Like, if you don't like me, choose a different mother. But I remember I would feel so powerless to that statement, I couldn't even respond. And probably, that was my mother's purpose, is to shut us up. But it's just so sad to me how extreme behaviors parents have to act out in order to have their children comply, when truly they could literally afford positive discipline so many cases, in so many scenarios, just by treating their children with respect, with kindness, and with firmness. There is a book literally titled Positive Discipline, written by Dr. Shane Nelson, and it is one of the most mesmerizing and interesting books I have ever read. Even I would say it is as interesting as religious texts, because it literally talks about modern day scenarios that literally happen in every household. And the reason I say it is one of the most interesting books, if not the most interesting I have ever read, is because I basically translated every scenario to individual level. So you do not necessarily have to comprehend the text inside a household situation, for example, because you can often have multiple parts within yourself that oppose each other. For example, one part of you wants to leave the house and another part of you is still sleeping and wants to stay in bed. But one part of you knows that you need to leave the house in order to go to work and make money and make a living and survive. But another part of you knows that you need sleep. So it's not even a feeling-based opposition. It's literally just knowing what's right for you. And that's where discipline and positive discipline or discipline come in the picture, because then you get to have a conversation instead of suppress one part at the expense of the other and make a compromise. Compromises are agreeing to disagree with parts of yourself or other people. That is not to say they are the solution. Finding a middle ground is the solution in every case. And I just feel so bad for people who are not, aware of the option of no compromises, because assuming you have literally no time to talk to your children or, to make a conscious decision based on one primary value when it comes to any decision or any option, it's hard to define, where right starts and when wrong gets punished. And God is never just love. It's, God is always also judgment, and it's inevitable. Like, we do not live in a world of love exclusively. Like, obviously some of us are very lucky and we have a lot of no resistance or, least resistance ease in our lives, because, for example, we could have a lot of money, or we could have a lot of social capital, or we could, have a very supportive family. But the majority of us in individualism are extremely under-resourced, both men and women, and we do not get punished by God because we do wrong, in the literal sense of the word, from God's perspective, but because we are already so separate that we punish ourselves by being so separate already to begin with. Like, our separation, our level of loneliness we are in right now is the punishment in and of itself. If you do not believe me, just open any scripture and you will see how any relationship starts with a conversation that is very conscious, very to the point, very, very timely, specific, but very creative. It can be, done in a million ways. Like, it can unfold 1,000, if not thousands of ways. And so it is true that there is nothing under the sun that hasn't been seen, but your individual experience is a vote. Like, it literally determines so much of our collective experience. You do not realize it. So God does not punish you for quote unquote wrong, because wrong tends to also be defined by the collective of humanity. But there are objectively wrong things in God's eyes that, often are very timely, or maybe if they exist eternally or regardless of time, they can be very unrecognized by people. This is not to say the only type of sin that exists is one that humanity glazes over, but that there are types of sins that can go unnoticed for so long. People only realize them later in time, like going back in time, and that doesn't make them, not a sin. And sometimes people can focus on other actions that make them kind of preoccupied with that thing for so long. But again, that doesn't take away from the power of other actions.